Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the system shaping our world one book at a time.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking on a really significant and I think challenging text. It's Angela Y. Davis's Abolition Democracy, Beyond Empire, Prisons, and Torture.
It's a powerful one, and it's not a traditional book in the way you might think. It's really a series of deep, probing conversations that get right to the heart of some major fault lines in American society.
Right. And for you listening, our mission today is strictly analytical. We are not here to debate policy or, the individual morality of people caught up in these systems.
Yeah.
Instead, we're focusing on the system design itself, the institutional continuity. We want to understand the framework Davis lays out for connecting things that we normally see as separate: a local jail, a state prison, and an overseas military base. That's the crucial point to get across from the very beginning. The big systemic question she forces us all to ask is this: is the modern network of prisons, police, and military detention, is it just a series of isolated failures? A few bad policies in a system that's otherwise basically sound.
Or is it something else?
Or is it, structurally and by design, a direct continuation of much older systems that were always rooted in racialized control and unfree labor?
And this matters so much right now because if you listen to the public discourse, mass incarceration and, global militarism, they're often framed as these necessary exceptions.
Tragic mistakes, maybe, but necessary.
Exactly. Tragic, but necessary to defend democracy. But Davis argues they aren't bugs in the system. They are features, essential features, in her view, for managing populations and for extracting wealth and political power. We're going to dive into the mechanics of that claim. So let's start with the author. Angela Y. Davis is a name many people know, but maybe not her full story. She's this just towering figure whose own life is so deeply tied to the subjects she writes about.
Absolutely. I mean, she was a former political prisoner herself, placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list in the early 70s on what turned out to be false charges. That lived experience of being targeted by the state, it gives her work an authority that goes beyond typical academic writing.
For sure. And her contributions as a scholar and activist are immense. A major feminist thinker, a former Communist Party candidate, and this is key for this book. In 1997, she co-founded Critical Resistance.
And that organization was explicitly created to dismantle what they termed the prison industrial complex, the PIC. The idea being that abolition isn't some fringe idea, but a core political project.
The format of Abolition Democracy is also really interesting. As you said, it's mainly a series of interviews conducted over 8 months by Eduardo Mendieta.
Right, which means it feels incredibly immediate. It was written right when the world was first seeing those shocking images and disclosures from Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib.
So she's connecting domestic prison abuse to imperial violence in real time.
Exactly. The book is an intellectual response to that crisis. But to really get the weight of her argument, you have to place her in this long tradition of Black critical political philosophy. She's in conversation with giants like Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois.
She doesn't just quote them, though. She's analyzing where their projects succeeded and, just as importantly, where they fell short.
And that critique of the past is the foundation for her argument about the present.
So let's go there. Let's talk about that period right after the Civil War, the brief and ultimately tragic period of Reconstruction.
Reconstruction was, for a very short time, this radical experiment in what a multiracial democracy could look like. You had Union troops in the South offering some protection. Black men were voting, holding office. Schools were being built.
But it didn't last.
It didn't last. The federal government pulled back, and almost immediately new systems of racial control were put in place. They were called the Black Laws, or Black Codes.
And these were not subtle.
Not at all. These were laws that criminalized the very fact of being a free Black person. Things like vagrancy, loitering, changing your job without permission, even speaking loudly could get you arrested. It was a full-court press to control Black labor and movement.
Which leads directly to this horrific system that many historians call worse than slavery.
The convict leasing system.
Why was it considered worse?
It's a chilling but important distinction to make. Under slavery, the slave owner had a property interest in the person, a financial incentive to keep them alive, at least enough to work. They were capital.
Right.
Under convict leasing, the state would arrest a Black man, often for a trivial crime, and then lease him out to a private corporation, a mine, a railroad, a plantation. The company had zero economic investment in that person's survival.
So they were completely expendable.
Completely. And the death rates were staggering, sometimes over 25% in a single year in some camps.
Yeah.
Du Bois wrote powerfully about this, saying the entire criminal justice system was weaponized to turn freedmen back into slaves of the state.
And this is where Davis brings in her critique of Frederick Douglass, which is so illuminating for modern politics.
It really is. Douglass was a titan, of course, but Davis points out his loud silence on convict leasing. He was so intensely focused on political liberty, specifically the right to vote.
He thought if black men could vote, they could fix the other problems later.
He had this deep, almost naive faith in the law as an impartial tool. He believed in formal political access. But while he was fighting for the ballot, thousands of black men were being worked to death on chain gangs. He didn't see that the law itself was the weapon being used to re-enslave them.
He missed the economic dimension.
He missed that the state was using its power to brand people as criminals, specifically to extract their labor. And for Davis, this is a crucial lesson. A focus on civil rights alone, without tackling the underlying systems of economic exploitation and state violence, will always allow new forms of unfreedom to emerge.
So that's the tradition she's building on. Which brings us to the core thesis of abolition democracy. Can you lay it out for us in plain language?
In plain language, her argument is this. Our modern systems of incarceration, punishment, and war, the prison-industrial complex and the military-industrial complex, are not mistakes. They aren't deviations from American democracy.
They are continuations.
They are structural continuations of slavery and racial capitalism. And because of that, real democracy, what she calls abolition democracy, can't be achieved by just reforming them. It requires their abolition and, crucially, the creation of new social institutions to take their place.
Okay, that's a huge claim. So let's break down the system piece by piece using that framework she provides. Historical system, institutional evolution, and then the present-day outcome. She starts with slavery as the foundation for modern punishment.
Right. Her analysis is that the historical system of slavery acted as a kind of legal container for extreme violence. In the 18th and 19th centuries, while the new democracy was deciding certain punishments were too barbaric for its white citizens.
It was dumping those same punishments onto the institution of slavery.
Exactly. You look at the legal codes. A white citizen might be executed for murder, but in some states, a black slave could be executed for up to 70 different offenses. Theft, arson, even just resisting a white person. Slavery gave the state legal cover to keep using these extreme forms of punishment, but only on racialized bodies.
So after abolition, the evolution wasn't to get rid of these punishments, it was just to rebrand them.
It was a process of what she calls de-racialization. You don't get rid of the practice, you just remove the explicitly racial language from the law. These punishments get absorbed into the general legal system, and now they're applied under the guise of colorblind justice.
The racism becomes invisible because it's baked into the structure of the law itself.
Yes, and that leads directly to the present-day outcome. The U.S. is the only industrialized nation that still routinely uses capital punishment. Davis argues the reason it persists isn't about justice or deterrence. It's a direct legacy of the racism embedded during slavery.
Even though it's now applied to people of all races.
It's disproportionately applied to people of color, but the formal due process, the legal procedure, shields the whole system from that critique. It legitimizes a racist outcome.
Okay, so from punishment theory to the institutions. Let's talk about prisons as instruments of racialized social control.
This takes us right back to the black laws and convict leasing. Those systems weren't just about labor, they were about symbolic control. They were a constant reminder to the newly freed population that true freedom hadn't actually arrived.
And she argues this evolves into something she calls the racial contract. Let's unpack that a bit. It's a pretty technical concept.
The racial contract is basically this unwritten agreement in American society that says white supremacy is the default. It works by accepting that certain people, racial minorities, are sort of outside the circle of full citizenship and its protections.
So things like mass incarceration and police violence are tolerated.
They're tolerated, even encouraged, because they're seen as happening to them, to the other, the so-called criminal population. It allows the rest of society, the imagined us, to feel safer, which reinforces the idea that this violence is necessary for social order.
It domesticates the imagination, as she says.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Which leads to the present-day outcome she calls ritual violence and social branding.
What does she mean by that?
Well, the prison system creates this vicious circular logic. Black people are in prison because they're criminals. They're criminals because the system identifies them as such. Therefore, they must have deserved it. It's a ritual that cleanses society of its anxieties. in a way that she says echoes the logic of lynchings at the turn of the century.
That's a powerful comparison. Lynchings were public spectacles.
They were. And imprisonment moved that violence behind walls, but the objectification is the same. And the result is a permanent social brand. Once you're incarcerated, you're a felon for life. And we know from studies that this brand sticks much harder to black ex-prisoners than to their white counterparts. It creates a permanent underclass that the prison system can feed on.
Which brings us to the economics of it all. Davis was instrumental in popularizing the term prison industrial complex, the PIC, and that name was chosen for a reason.
A very strategic reason. It's meant to echo the military-industrial complex, or MIC, that Eisenhower warned about. She saw they had the same core logic. They both generate huge profits, not from creating social good, but from controlling, warehousing, and maiming human beings. They turn destruction into a growth industry.
And this isn't just about companies making money from prison labor, right? She talks about a much broader form of extraction, appropriating black social wealth.
This is such a critical insight. It goes way beyond just paying prisoners pennies on the dollar to work. Social wealth is the collective capital that sustains a community. The money, the schools, the social networks.
So how does the prison system appropriate that?
Well, when you incarcerate over 2 million people, and 70% of them are people of color, you are physically removing an enormous amount of labor, income, and political power from those communities. Money that would have gone to schools, to home ownership, to local businesses, it's all siphoned off.
And redirected to fund the prison system itself.
Exactly. It creates a cycle of poverty and resource depletion. The PIC doesn't just manage populations, it actively bankrupts them. And this whole machine is propped up by what she calls surplus repression and manufacturing consent.
Meaning the system has to convince us that prisons are the only solution.
It has to convince us they are not just inevitable, but desirable. This is the logic of the imprisonment binge. Anytime society has a complex problem, homelessness, illiteracy, mental illness, job loss from deindustrialization, the prison becomes a default answer.
Instead of funding social programs, we fund more cells.
Precisely. Davis draws a direct line from the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, which gutted the social safety net, to the sharp rise in women's incarceration. When you remove economic support, people are pushed into survival strategies that land them in prison. The prison becomes a way to make social problems, and the people experiencing them, disappear.
So we've mapped the domestic system, but the book's subtitle is Beyond Empire, Prisons, and Torture. She connects this domestic logic directly to what happens offshore.
This is where her analysis becomes truly global. She sees this deep, symbiotic link between the PIC and the MIC. On one level, you have personnel moving between them. Young people of color might enlist in the military specifically to escape the path to prison.
And the economic ties.
They're there too. Defense contractors actively recruit prison labor. You have incarcerated people building weapons that are then used for global military dominance. The violence is integrated at every level.
The really chilling idea, though, is what she calls the carceral continuum, the idea that the techniques are the same everywhere.
Yes. She argues that the practices we accept as normal inside U.S. prisons are not fundamentally different from the torture we saw at Abu Ghraib. Things like sexual coercion, strip searches that are essentially sexual assault, sensory deprivation in supermax prisons, these are all normalized techniques of control in the domestic system.
And the case of Charles Grainer at Abu Ghraib is the smoking gun for this argument.
It's the perfect, horrifying confirmation. Grainer wasn't just some random soldier who snapped. He was a prison guard at a supermax facility in Pennsylvania, SCI Green, and he already had multiple lawsuits against him for abusing prisoners before he was sent to Iraq. He was recruited by the military for his experience.
So his actions weren't an anomaly?
They were the logical result of exporting the personnel, the techniques, and the mindset of the American prison system and applying it to a new population of racialized captives.
So if the system is this deeply embedded, the common response is to call for reform, better laws, more oversight. But Davis says liberal reform is not enough.
This is a core part of her critique. The civil rights movement was vital. It secured access for some. But a rights-based approach alone can't fix structural racism that's built into the economy and the penal system. As she puts it, the goal isn't to get equal opportunity to participate in the machinery of oppression.
The example she uses of women in the military is so jarring.
It really is. She says when women gain the equal opportunity to torture prisoners, that isn't progress. That's a fraudulent equality. The oppressive structure, the military, the prison, remains fundamentally violent and misogynistic, no matter the gender of the person carrying out the orders.
And this illusion of equality is propped up by making the laws colorblind.
It's the perfect defense. When you remove overt racial language from the law, the system can claim to be neutral. But it allows the underlying class and race biases to decide who ends up in prison. The law is designed to ignore the social context. Poverty, bad schools, lack of jobs that funnels people into the system.
So formal due process just ends up justifying a racist outcome.
Exactly. The judge can say, we follow the rules, the outcome is fair, because the rules themselves are rigged to ignore reality.
Which brings us to her definition of abolition. It's not just about tearing things down.
Not at all. This is where she leans heavily on Du Bois and his idea of abolition democracy. Du Bois argued that the first abolition, the abolition of slavery, failed because it was only negative. The chains were removed, but nothing was built to replace slavery.
There was no land, no education, no economic power.
Right. And that failure to build new democratic institutions led directly to new forms of unfreedom, like convict leasing. So Davis argues that modern prison abolition has to be a constructive project. It's about building up the things that make prisons unnecessary: housing, healthcare, education, mental health services. The goal is to make the prison obsolete by solving the problems that feed it.
Okay, so that's the historical analysis. Let's zoom out and explicitly map the system as it runs today. What are the core components that keep it going, even when we know how harmful it is?
We can break it down into 4 parts: actors and infrastructure, incentives, narratives, and feedback loops. So for the actors, you've got the obvious domestic ones: prisons, courts, police. But she shows the hidden links, like how the first SWAT teams were trained by Vietnam veterans, directly importing military tactics into domestic policing.
The line between soldier and police officer gets very blurry.
Very blurry. Then you have all the private contractors profiting from everything from food service to phone calls. And then you have the imperial components: military prisons like Guantanamo, immigrant detention centers. And private contractors are involved there too, flying people around the globe in what they call extraordinary rendition.
And you can't forget the political mechanism she maps: disenfranchisement.
It is absolutely central to how the PIC maintains political power. 48 states take away your right to vote while you're incarcerated. Many states do it for life. Davis argues this isn't an accident. It's a core function, a way to surgically remove political power from communities of color. She makes the case that the 2000 election, for instance, might have gone differently without felon disenfranchisement.
So those are the actors. What about the incentives and drivers? What keeps this engine running?
Well, first is social control. The system manages what she calls dispensable populations, people made redundant by global capitalism and deindustrialization. It's a way of making deep social problems seem to disappear.
And then there's the straightforward profit motive.
Huge. Economic extraction is a primary driver now. The punishment industry isn't some small market. It's a major part of the U.S. economy. Countless corporations have a vested financial interest in keeping the prisons full.
And finally, political legitimacy.
This is the ideological fuel. Being tough on crime is a guaranteed political winner. It helps politicians get elected by tapping into public fear, even while, as Davis notes, crime rates have been falling for decades. It's a powerful narrative.
So let's talk about those narratives and ideologies. How does the system manufacture our consent?
It works by creating a constant sense of fear, a moral panic focused on an external enemy: the criminal, the terrorist, the immigrant. Davis traces this enemy figure through history. In the Cold War, it was the communist. Then in the Law and Order era, it became the criminal, who was a racialized stand-in for the communist. And after 9/11, it became the terrorist.
And the common thread through all three is racism.
Racism is the key ingredient in producing all 3 of those enemy figures. And once you have that racialized enemy, she says, virtually anything becomes acceptable: torture, brutality, vast expenditures, as long as it is done in the name of public safety.
Which feeds this idea of democracy with exceptions.
Right. The belief in American exceptionalism, the idea that America is uniquely good, justifies extreme violence against those designated as others. It reduces democracy to this thing you can export by force, rather than a living practice of justice at home.
So we have the actors, the incentives, the narratives. What are the feedback loops that make the system so hard to dismantle?
It's a self-justifying system. For example, we use prisons as a solution for failing schools. Then, when those kids end up in prison, it reinforces poverty in their communities, which makes the schools fail even more for the next generation. It's a perfect circle.
And more surveillance leads to more arrests, which justifies the need for more surveillance.
Exactly. And this loop also normalizes the violence. The routine, everyday violence inside a domestic prison makes the extreme torture offshore seem less shocking. It becomes just a difference of degree, not of kind. The system is designed to stop us from asking the really big questions like, is prison the only way? Or is this even working?
Okay, let's pivot and bring this analysis right into the present day. How does this framework help us understand the world around us right now? Let's start with mass incarceration itself.
Well, the sheer scale of it, over 2 million people behind bars in the U.S., 70% people of color, it's not because Americans are inherently more criminal. Davis argues it's the direct result of specific policies. Mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, truth in sentencing. These laws were designed to fill prisons, and they worked.
She also points out a really telling contradiction in our drug policies.
This is such a sharp observation. She contrasts the war on drugs, which criminalized crack cocaine and devastated poor black communities, with the simultaneous explosion in prescription drugs like Prozac, Ritalin, Viagra.
Both are chemical ways to alter your state of being.
But one is sold for massive corporate profit to the insured and affluent, and the other is used to justify the repression of the poor. It reveals that the real line between legal and illegal is often about who profits, not about morality or public health.
Now, shifting to the global stage, Guantanamo Bay is the ultimate symbol of this system for Davis.
It's what she calls an outlaw military prison. It was physically placed outside the U.S. to be outside the reach of U.S. law. And she reminds us it was used as a legal black hole even before 9/11 to detain HIV-positive Haitian refugees in the 90s.
And the term enemy combatant is the key to how it functions now.
It's a legal fiction. That term doesn't exist in international law. It was invented to strip detainees of all human rights protections. And this leads to practices like extraordinary rendition, the U.S. outsourcing torture to other countries to keep its own hands officially clean.
The political rhetoric around the war on terror was also a key part of this.
When a president says a suspect is wanted dead or alive, Davis says that's not just tough talk. It's a deliberate lowering of political discourse. It taps into these Old West fantasies that turn complex global politics into a simplistic story of good guys and bad guys. And that kind of talk directly fuels racist violence at home and lawless behavior by the military abroad.
Let's come back to those Abu Ghraib photos. Her analysis of why they were so shocking is really counterintuitive.
It is. She says the shock wasn't really about the torture itself. The shock was that we saw it, that there was visual proof. She draws this chilling parallel to old lynching photos, which were public, celebrated, often pornographic displays of racial power.
So violence moves from public spectacle to hidden institution, but the logic remains.
The logic of racial and sexualized objectification as a tool of total domination? Yes. And the fact that women were perpetrators at Abu Ghraib forces a more complex feminist analysis.
Right, it challenges the simple idea of women as victims.
It does. For Davis, this is proof of that fraudulent equality. Women get the equal opportunity to participate in the violence.
Yeah.
It shows that you can't just add women to a violent misogynistic institution like the military and expect it to become less violent. You have to dismantle the institution itself.
This critique extends to things like multicultural reform in government, seeing people like Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice in high office.
She sees this as a failure of a certain kind of identity politics. When you have people of color in positions of power, carrying out the same oppressive policies, structural racism actually becomes more effective. It's harder to criticize because it's masked by the appearance of diversity.
She makes a really provocative statement about this.
She does. She says she would gladly trade a black woman Secretary of State for a white man who would actually work to end global war. Her point is that the political goals, justice, peace, and end to oppression, have to come before identity markers. Identity alone is not enough.
So we've traced this logic of control from the 19th century to today. Let's bring it back to the core themes of this show, crisis and perception. How does this book help us see systems at work?
First and foremost, it forces us to look past individual blame. The media coverage of Abu Ghraib was all about finding a few aberrant individuals to blame, to protect the image of U.S. democracy as a whole.
It's the system's ultimate defense mechanism. Blame the individual, protect the institution.
Exactly. Davis insists that the abuse wasn't a moral failure of a few soldiers. It was the logical outcome of an institutional culture of objectification that is completely routine in the U.S. punishment system.
So this is how violence gets normalized through our institutions.
Yes. She argues that the PIC is basically how the state carries out a form of systemic terrorism. Not random violence, but a strategic way of managing the social problems created by an unjust political economy. And there's a continuum. The routine violence in domestic prisons makes the extreme violence offshore possible.
You made a really interesting point earlier that the domestic supermax prison might be a greater long-term threat than Guantanamo. Why?
Because Guantanamo is, at least sometimes, recognized as an outlaw place, an exception. The supermax, on the other hand, is normalized. Its horrors, the sensory deprivation, the total isolation are considered necessary procedure. It's accepted as part of the system. And because it's normalized, its long-term effect on our collective imagination, on what we accept as possible, is far more dangerous.
And finally, this analysis helps explain why our democratic ideals can coexist so comfortably with such coercive realities.
Her argument is that U.S. democracy, in a way, needs the prison to define itself. Our rights and liberties are defined in relation to what is explicitly denied to the incarcerated population: civil death, loss of the vote, subjection to violence. American freedom is defined against its opposite.
And that ties back to the idea of democracy as a commodity to be exported.
Yes, this hollowed-out version of democracy, focused only on voting, allows the U.S. to ignore its own massive internal contradictions while claiming moral authority on the world stage. It's a democracy of empty gestures.
So after this deep dive, what does this book force us to rethink about something as fundamental as freedom?
It forces us to see that real freedom isn't just about getting access to the current system. It's about having the equal right to refuse and resist oppressive systems altogether. It's a liberation from having to participate in violence.
And it requires a complete reimagining of punishment and social order.
Completely. It means recognizing that the prison has failed as a solution to social problems. And abolition, in her view, means shifting our resources away from punishment and towards the things that actually create safety and well-being: housing, education, healthcare.
So ultimately, abolition is about systemic imagination.
It's a call for a democracy that is to come, a constructive project to build a society where the first response to a problem is care and support, not cages and exclusion. It's about finishing the work that the first abolition movement started.
Which leaves us with one last provocative thought for you to consider.
If so much of our current political discourse is designed to simplify, to disarm our critical thinking and push us back into fear and nationalism, that dead or alive mentality, then the challenge for all of us is, how do we complicate that discourse? How do we build connections across communities, Black, Arab, Latino, Asian, to see ourselves not just as citizens of one nation, but as part of a global community capable of resisting these interconnected systems of violence? It requires a kind of intellectual courage to refuse the simple answers and imagine something new.
This deep dive was based on the book Abolition Democracy: Beyond Empire, Prisons, and Torture, featuring the essential work of Angela Y. Davis. We encourage you to seek out this work and read it, or borrow it from your local library. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. Good. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.